Whether it's helping Colombian farmers struggling to replace illegal coca crops or training peacekeepers in the Sudan, experts say smart power, a strategic blend of defense, diplomacy, and development, is essential, not only to our safety, but our economic survival as well. In a recent poll, 90% of active and retired military officers agreed a strong military is not enough to keep America safe. The tools of diplomacy and development, they say, are critical to achieving U.S. national security objectives. Yet, our international affairs budget is about 1% of federal spending, and with budget axes poised to fall, even that could be in danger. Joining me to talk about that and much more, former U.S. Senator Richard Bryan. He's the co-chair of Nevada's subcommittee of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. That's a national effort to preserve spending on international diplomacy and development. A pleasure to have you here, Senator.
John, nice to be back with you.
I want to talk about this issue, and we'll talk some politics later on. I'm sure people will be interested in your views on the presidential race and many other issues of the day. But let's talk about this U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. How'd you get involved in this in the first place?
I got contacted several months ago and asked whether I'd be willing to participate. And I said, well, tell me a little bit more about it. Frankly, I didn't know a whole lot about the organization, looked into it. I think your intro covered it very nicely. And they said, well, look, we need somebody as a Republican, bipartisan. I said, well, my preference would be Senator Bill Raggio. He and I had traveled to China together some 33 years ago. He's always been interested in international things, and Senator Raggio agreed, and so the two of us became, in effect, the co-chairs here in Nevada.
So 33 years ago, you both were in your 20s at the time. Is that correct, sir?
As a matter of fact, I had to get my mother's permission before I know.
There you go. All right, let's talk about what appeals to you about doing something like this, why you think this is so important.
You know, when I was in office in the previous century, and it's true today, people hate foreign aid. You know, now with the budget crisis, it's bringing us to an impasse on almost every appropriation bill. And if you ask the public at any kind of a town hall meeting, and I had hundreds in my time, everybody said, well, how about cutting that foreign aid budget? And you ask people, how much do you think the foreign aid budget is? They say, oh, 20, 25%. I think you accurately characterize it at about 1%. I make this personal analogy, and I don't know whether it carried me through, but I said, look, I'm the first generation of Americans in the 20th century not to fight in Europe. I said my grandfather was in World War I. My father, who was medically unable to serve, was in the generation of World War II. When George Marshall, in June of 1947, proposed the Marshall Plan, which provided money to rebuild Germany, you know, the sponsor of a genocide killing 6 million people who had inflicted horrendous casualties upon Americans, it was a tough sell, but I believe the Marshall Plan saved Western Europe from communist encroachment. I think it provided the stability that made it possible for the better part of that century, the rest of that century today, to prevent the kind of thing that occurred earlier. So I always thought that I was the beneficiary, that I served in the Army, but never heard a shot fired in anger, John.
You know, it's interesting, Senator, because we just celebrated the 10th year anniversary of 9/11, and retired General Hugh Shelton, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on 9/11, he wrote recently for CNN about a briefing on September 12, 2001, when President Bush was told al-Qaeda was behind the attack. The general says all eyes turned to him as if asking, what do we do? And here's what he said. But before we could respond, President Bush himself interrupted. He said, we'll get to the military tools, but first, let's talk about what we can do diplomatically and economically. This was an extraordinary statement, and I believe the first indication of the new comprehensive national security strategy required in the post-9/11 world. In that moment, we saw for the first time it would take all of the tools in America's foreign policy arsenal working together in order to keep us safe from terrorists and extremists. Now, I don't want to talk about what later decisions were made by that administration, but essentially...
But he was right.
He's right,
He's right. He's right. And in fact, you know, Democratic and Republican foreign policy leaders have been a part of this coalition, and there's wide bipartisan support, you know, at the top level for these kind of efforts, from, you know, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and those that preceded them.
It's really an education effort, isn't it, more than anything?
It really is. I mean, it's very hard when people have lost their jobs. Pretty hard to say, what are we doing giving money to country A or B? And frankly, there have been some monumental failures. Not all of those efforts have been successful. And the argument, and it's understandable, why don't we take care of the people at home? You know, they're the ones that are suffering. I mean, look at our unemployment rate and, you know, the terrible financial tragedies that people experience every day. In the broader scope of thing, in terms of our own international security, we've got to pay attention to what's happening abroad. And this 33 years ago that I talked about when I was in China with Bill Raggio, nobody at that point ever dreamed that China would become a global power. They're a major challenge for us, not only in the Pacific, but the world. And they are spending far more money in investing in Africa and South America, and they're not doing it because they want to help make this a better and more secure world. They have interest in securing resources and developing these friendships and these relationships. We need to pay attention to that, John.
Welcome back across Nevada to Face to Face. Some of you watching tonight probably think the foreign affairs budget, the international affairs budget, 25%, 30% of the entire budget. No, it's very small. It's only about 1%. But how important is it that the United States remain engaged in the world? There's a new educational effort going on, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. They have subcommittees in many states. The one here is being led by former State Senator Bill Raggio and former U.S. Senator Richard Bryan is joining us to talk about that, and we'll get to some politics later on. Let's talk about why it's so important to stay engaged. Here's what the President and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said this year about the international affairs budget. We have no choice but to stay engaged in the world. 95% of the people we want to sell something to live somewhere else, and America's access to and leadership in foreign markets is critical. We're the largest exporters in the world by a significant factor, and we need to capitalize on that. Do you think that we're growing here, that the public is growing more insular, though, in their outlook, whether it's because of the economy, whether it's because the extremes on each side try to pander sometimes to the extremes in the public?
I think the overarching concern with the American people, the jobs, the economy. And so if you're talking about foreign policy and foreign issues, that becomes much more difficult. I think what needs to be done as part of this educational process is to link the very things that you've been talking about, some of the development efforts, the diplomatic efforts, and how that's a job creator for us. About 1 out of every 4 jobs in Nevada is linked to export. And indeed, if the economy is going to get back on its feet, one of the great potentials, our manufacturing sector has done reasonably well in terms of our exports. We've got to grow that sector, and obviously there is a role for the federal government to assist manufacturers and others in the United States in terms of exporting those projects through Export Import Bank, the development, the DIA, and a whole host of other export assistance programs.
You know, it's interesting you mention that, Senator, because aside from gaming and construction, manufacturing exports are a strong part of Nevada's economy. 90% of our total, accounting for 90% of our total exports. Here's what Nevada exported internationally in 2010. $187 million in mining, $734 million in manufactured goods, $966 million in computers and electronics, and $2.4 billion in primary metal manufacturing. I mean, it's essential, but I bet people are stunned to hear those numbers, right?
No, and I think even sophisticated people,
right,
John.
exactly.
I mean, because you
I was
think,
surprised to read them, frankly.
Frankly, as I hadn't seen those numbers in that fashion, but I mean, I'm surprised to hear some of that too. I mean, most people think, hey, it's tourism, and yeah, you've got mining, and hey, look, construction. Those were the big 3 things that we heard about. That's not true today in construction, as we all know.